Welcome to Around the Empire. This is a fully independent podcast. Now more than ever, independent media needs the support of listeners and viewers. Visit the website aroundtheempire.com to find out how to support the podcast and how to gain access to the bonus content. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a Swapcast with the host of the Conflicts of Interest podcast. That's Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman. We talk about the crisis in U.S. Russian relations, and this roundtable first covers Washington and NATO's written responses to Moscow regarding last month's Russia security proposals. And then we discuss the threat of war, the potential scope of such a war, why Russia is likely no longer concerned about further U.S. sanctions, the role of CIA paramilitaries on the front line, the shutdown of the Ukrainian opposition, and the increasing influence of Nazis and Nazi-adjacent elements in Ukraine's power structures. And there's also a conversation on the Biden-Putin relationship, the malign influence of the Victoria Nuland circle, and the recently renamed Normandy Format style talk with the Russians, Ukrainians, the French, and the Germans. We recorded this on January 26, 2022.
All right, Connor, Joanne. Connor, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Kyle?
Very
well.
How
are you,
Joanne? Yeah, Joanne.
Hanging in there. Hope you guys are doing well.
Yeah. So, Joanne, I wanted to kind of let you open up our panel here today as we're talking about this mess in Ukraine. And I guess I don't exactly know where to start. I feel like a lot of the analysts and a lot of the people that we all read kind of have conflicting views over this, not necessarily the origins of the crisis, but certainly what the coming, Russian positions will be and what steps Putin will be willing to take, and also what the Americans are going to do and how much Biden's going to be willing to negotiate. And so I guess I kind of want for us to just talk about our thoughts on this. I think it'll be really interesting and our listeners will like it. So, Joanne.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Picked a good day to talk about this subject since things kind of blew up today, right? I don't exactly know why the timing was today, but the U.S. ambassador to Russia, Sullivan, went to the Russian Foreign Ministry today and delivered these papers, right, which were the official response to Russia's demand for security assurances, no expansion of NATO and so on. So as a result, Blinken did a press conference and Stoltenberg did a NATO press conference. I watched both of them, God help me. And I can't say that there was a whole lot in them, although one thing I found curious is that Matt Lee, who's the best State Department journalist out there who attends all of the briefings, things like that, I had the same question he did. He kind of Blinken went on for 20 minutes or something, and Matt Lee just kind of boiled it down. He's like, so did you basically say no to the Russians? And Blinken, he didn't answer it straight up, but what he did say is that there was nothing in those documents that they haven't said publicly in recent weeks, and he said, and frankly, in recent years. So I guess I wonder if that's true, then why didn't they just make the document public? Why are these secret documents that they dropped off at the Russian Foreign Ministry? So I wonder if there are other things in there. I have wondered all along if there's other things that they're arguing about or talking about in the background that they just don't want to make public. But
Joanne, on that point, maybe just to expand a little bit on the secrecy of the letter, I guess I've seen people interpret this in two ways. One is that the U.S. basically wrote Russia an FU letter, right? Like, we're willing to negotiate on some missiles in Ukraine, but beyond that, we're going to do what we want. or that they did it because they're offering something that might actually work. And for whatever reason, maybe it's fear of the American hearts, or somebody brought up to me today that I think is a fantastic point, out of, fear of what the Ukrainians will do and how they will react. Maybe, they'll try to strong arm the Biden administration or something like that. That carrying out in secret could actually be a good thing, because they'll prevent Hots from overreacting. And I mean, if we're being honest, like, if as many people watch this as watched CNN and everything like that, then maybe the influence would go the direction that we want it to go, and that this being public would be good. But I mean, just the way it works in the United States right now, if it's a public conversation, I think the Hots are going to have the loudest voice. And generally, I think Biden's squishy enough to be pushed on this issue in the way that the public, that he perceives as the mainstream media, is pushing him to go.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. In that case, I don't know why he didn't just say then, or why did he go out of his way to say, like, yeah, there's nothing in there that we haven't, said publicly in recent weeks. But hey, he could have his reasons. Lavrov really blew off Stoltenberg, really. He's just like, I don't listen to that guy. No, for real. There's like a clip I sent you, Kyle, remember?
Yeah.
He's just like, really?
He says that Stoltenberg isn't
seriously.
in the same reality. I think he said that Stoltenberg isn't in reality or something like that. So yeah.
Right. And Lavrov said that, there's just military mania going on here. So it's, it sounded like it was blowing the whole thing off. But at the same time, like, I talked to Mark Sloboda today, recorded an interview, which will be out soon. Because, I've been wondering a lot about the military exercises that are going on in Belarus. And I wasn't sure that they were snap exercises. They were not planned. They weren't announced. They just happened. And that's one of the things that Stoltenberg brought up in his speech. He was griping about, I guess he was saying, well, let me just back up for 1 second. Both Blinken, so that both the State Department, the U.S. State Department, and NATO both delivered documents to the Russians. I think Blinken said something about they were in harmony. There wasn't anything, conflicting in them. But what Stoltenberg brought was, he said, the position of all 30 NATO members showing solidarity. That seemed to be one of, I guess, his main goal was to have every single NATO country, say, we're in agreement, whatever. We're in on it. We're all in, because that has been questionable over in recent weeks. Certainly, it hasn't looked like they were all in harmony at all. So anyway, one of the things Stoltenberg brought up was it looked like they went to Russia and said, no, we're not going to give you what you want. But here's what we want. I mean, that's what it sounded like to me. And one of the things that he was complaining about was, he said there wasn't enough transparency on exercises, which certainly was a reference to the Belarus exercises going on right now, which are, I was talking to Mark Sloboda, like I said, and getting back to Kyle's opener, the different opinions that different people have. I don't think I tend to be an alarmist, but I'm taking this seriously. I think this really could turn into something bad. Now, I thought the same thing back in April, just, full disclosure, and it didn't happen. It just kind of flipped on its head and didn't happen at the last minute, but it was looking pretty serious back then too. I guess the same thing could happen this time, but I see different things going on this time. Last time I didn't see planes flying from the UK back and forth and bringing all of this equipment. I didn't see the CIA admitting that they've had paramilitaries in Ukraine for years now. I don't think anyway, Biden putting 8,500 troops on, extra high alert. And just in general, that whole tripwire force and troops that we've got in Eastern European countries, which was outrageous when they first did it. Now it's just like, hey, yeah, we've got troops in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia and so on, and they rotate. But I'm not sure. It seems like the number of troops has grown. So I just think the situation is different now. It's more serious. And the way the Russians are acting is definitely different. I won't go into too much of that because I know you guys have some things to say on it. But, Sloboda, I don't want to give away everything he said, but he takes it very seriously, too. He thinks there's like a 60% chance that it happens.
And the Sloboda episode will be the next in the Around the Empire feed. So be sure to subscribe to that if you aren't already. Joanne, I just wanted to note that, and I was pretty sure this was the case, that in the December 30th news roundup, I did have that Putin had announced that they were going to carry out war games in Belarus in early 2022. So, I mean, Stoltenberg could say that, it was a surprise and everything, but they had talked about it. And I guess on that issue, it does seem like Putin has at least made an effort in recent weeks, like talking about deploying troops to Venezuela and Cuba, and also the announcement of the major naval war game exercises that they're carrying out all over, Russian waters and around them. And, maybe the point is to show the, Western countries that this is intolerable, and so we're going to then announce war games and carry them out in a month because they're just trying to match what they see the U.S. or NATO countries doing.
Yeah, I remember being a lot more worried about the Black Sea, things going on in the Black Sea last time than this time. But to be honest, I haven't really even been following too much what's going on there. I mean, it can't be good, though.
Yeah. Well, I guess one thing to add to your point of just, one of the reasons I guess I feel I'm more concerned this time than versus April or in the past, like with the Kerch Strait incident or something like that. Yeah, there seems to be a lot more media pressure on it this time. Not that they weren't concerned in April, but this was the Sunday morning shows this week. Blinken was everywhere. Americans are all well aware of it. And, the narrative is, that the Biden administration is condemning Russia. They're willing to sanction Russia. And, the range of thought is that okay? Or is that not enough? And do we need to go further? And so I guess part of it could be maybe that I'm just overreacting to the media and the media turning the dial up to 10, even if I am pretty resistant to that. It does, I guess, make everybody feel a little bit more anxious. At the same time, I think that's a legitimate concern that we have, that the media has established this narrative in the U.S. that, Biden is going to be doing the minimum, but does he need to do more? And what kind of situation does that create? Even if this does get diffused, unless it gets diffused in a way that is, permanent, we're talking about an agreement that actually solidifies Ukraine's place as a non-NATO country, likely a good amount of autonomy for the Donbass region. I mean, and really, if we're being honest, recognition that Crimea is now a part of Russia, and at least a willingness to start to remove some of those sanctions and economic penalties to move towards a normalization of relations with Russia, right? Like these are the things that absolutely have to take place. And it just seems like it's going to be absolutely impossible now with where the discourse in America is.
Yeah, it's going in the wrong direction for sure.
All right, let's let Connor talk.
Well, it seems like I agree with both of you, but it seems like the sort of the neoconservative push for eastward expansion of NATO is just reaching a boiling point, and the Russians aren't going to be putting up with it anymore. But I think the context is lost on. Unfortunately, I think Americans are aware enough to not want to go to war with Russia. We're seeing some good polling on that, where they say only 1 in 6 are in supportive of like putting boots on the ground and this sort of thing. But to Kyle's point and to your point, they just keep saying, impose sanctions now, because why wait until later? And I think some of the Ukrainian officials, even Zelensky, was saying that up until recently. And what that would do is basically say, of course, to Putin that, like, regardless of what you do, if you show restraint or if you actually go in, you're going to suffer the same penalties, cutting you off from the economic system and, trying to kill Nord Stream 2. And of course, the Ukrainians have a huge interest in that. But I'm encouraged, of course, because the Germans are sort of standing in the way of that, and the French. I like that they've taken a more independent position, although they were saying things today like, there were mixed signals from the French and the Germans today, where you have like, it sounded like there was some good news coming out of the Normandy Format talks that. So I guess I heard Dan McAdams quote a Ukrainian official or Ukrainian representative from yesterday saying, like, we've unlocked the format, and that they were basically saying good things, like we have a likelihood, or it's a good sign that we could be reaching a peaceful resolution of the crisis. And they said that would be in Ukraine's interest. And then the French came out and said that they had heard good things from the Russians and that they were encouraged. Macron will be talking to Putin on Friday. The Germans, of course, are sticking with their policy of not sending weaponry and not allowing even their airspace to be used to send weaponry to Ukraine. They pissed off Klitschko today because they sent 5,000 helmets instead of any sort of real military aid, which I thought was good too. And so I guess the talks are on a temporary pause, those Normandy Format talks, and they'll be meeting in Berlin in 2 weeks. But they did, for what it's worth, come out and say that all four parties in a joint statement said that they would unconditionally uphold a ceasefire along the lines of the Minsk Accords. So, and also the Ukrainians are throwing cold water on the American hyperbolic rhetoric that's coming from particularly, Jen Psaki. Even Kirby seems to be less alarmist than Jen Psaki is, or Wendy Sherman. So, I mean, Psaki is coming out and she's almost debating the Ukrainians over how imminent the Russian invasion is, which is interesting because, it dawned on me the other day that we're in a really bad position. Like, even if you take, as I've said before, reading Ray McGovern helps you take a little bit more of an optimistic route, or an optimistic, he offers an optimistic perspective, I should say, that a lot of this is kind of bluster for domestic consumption, and that one of the reasons, Gilbert Doctorow and Ray McGovern mentioned this ahead of time, that they weren't going to be making the details of the letter public because hopefully, that it's got some real concessions in there, because they're not going to accept. Obviously, Georgia and Ukraine, I don't think, are being brought into NATO. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the Germans or the French would let that happen. And it's against the NATO charter because they have unstable borders and you have Russians in both countries. And even though the Hawks act like that somehow doesn't mean anything, it obviously would start a war instantly. But at the same time, Tom Cotton and these GOP senators are coming out and saying Biden's impotent and incompetent, and calling for high Russian casualty counts, or intolerably high Russian casualty counts, as Roger Wicker has said. They're just pouring weapons in. And it's stuff like even what's his name? Trudeau came out and said they announced they're adding like more than almost $300 million more today. It's like 260 something to their Operation Unifier, which is like their special operations program in Ukraine. And they're sending 60 more personnel. And they're like, it has a limit of like 400 people, 400 special operations advisors we can send. And the British are sending more and more commandos and, advisors again, pouring the short range missiles in there. And you have the GOP saying we should do more of that. So it seems to me like I'm hoping. What I was going to say was that it dawned on me the other day that we're almost relying on Blinken and Biden to do the right thing here to avert the crisis and the war. And that's not a good position, obviously, for us to be in. I don't know if it's, and I was like, would I rather have Pompeo on the other side of that table from Lavrov? And I think on some level, I almost prefer Blinken here because he's such a weak link. And I think that even Biden, for whatever reason, seems to have a better chemistry on the phone with Putin because he doesn't have the Russiagate baggage on him. and they can come to, like the December 30th call when the Russians came out, and Sullivan didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but they had apparently promised that we're not putting offensive strike weapons in Ukraine. Don't worry about that. So I think that's a good sign. I'm very hopeful that, the fact that Blinken came out before this past weekend, before the letter was, delivered, that he had said that they were able to work. There's room to work with them on missile placement, on the NATO drills, the Russian drills in the region. There's, the transparency and missile placement overall. I think they're going to have to come to some sort of agreement where they pull troops and military NATO installations out of countries on Russia's borders. I don't see how that can fly anymore. Basically, it seems, I'm hoping that, like I said, that they made some concessions in this letter. But for the most part, it seems like the Americans and the British are still dead set on raising tensions, and obviously the Congress is, and the media. And it doesn't sound like Lavrov was impressed. And even Stoltenberg came out and said, we prefer diplomacy. We want to talk with the Russians more, but we're prepared for the worst. And he pointed to the fact that they've moved S-400s, I believe, into Belarus, he said, for the drills coming up, which, as Gilbert Doctorow was noting earlier, they're moving into the theater. They're moving Iskander missiles, which can, do hot, precise, and highly destructive strikes on Kiev. They're moving in, obviously, the naval drills. They've got landing naval vessels in the Black Sea now. And of course the S-400s, which means that they can impose a no-fly zone on these planes coming in, bringing in more and more weapons, and the Black Sea reconnaissance missions, and even the reconnaissance flights that were flying over Ukraine in I guess that was either December or November. I've sort of lost track at this point, but we had U.S. spy planes doing that. So I think the Russians are very serious, but it doesn't seem to me like it's inevitable. I think we're probably, as bad as leadership is in the West, and particularly in the United States, I think I don't think they're willing to blow the planet up over all this, but I think a mistake could easily happen. And they do seem like they refuse to rescind the Bucharest summit promise to Georgia and Ukraine for NATO membership, which, as I said, is not workable on any level. So that's also not a good sign. But I like I said, I think that Biden, they said that Biden helped write the letter to Putin. So that might be a good sign. I don't know if I believe that, of course, because he's his faculties are super questionable. At the same time, those phone calls, some of the stuff that came out of his conversations directly with Putin seem more reassuring than the rhetoric we get typically from Blinken and the other hawks. So, that's essentially my take. It's all kind of a mess, but we're seeing sort of mixed signs, I feel like, today. It could be going in a good direction, or it could be going in a much worse direction fast.
Yeah, so actually that's a perfect part of where I wanted to start, Connor, and to say that, as much as you hear Biden had a role in writing it, you want to make a joke about how his is the part in red crayon or something like that. The reality is that Biden being an old ass man may actually help us here, right? For the majority of Joe Biden's life, East Germany existed as its own country that was within the USSR sphere of orbit. You know what I mean? Ukraine is a former Russian Empire state. The Baltic states are now a part of NATO. And so Joe Biden has to remember that when he was a kid and looked at the globe in the classroom, the USSR existed and now it doesn't. And so, when you look at some of the analysis, Ray McGovern, who's one of the more optimistic takes on this, one of the older hands, maybe that's part of what Ray realizes too, that Biden absolutely has to realize this, how much the map has changed. And, none of the Cold Warriors would have ever imagined that Kiev would be a part of NATO and not Russia. That was never a thought. This is a major city a few hundred miles from Moscow. The fact that they're talking about making this a NATO member state is absolutely crazy. And so I want to start there, that maybe Biden, being kind of a guy who grew up during the Cold War, kind of realizes the status of what a Russian sphere of influence is, where Ukraine is, and what kind of influence NATO could possibly have there. And then also, Biden really understanding what NATO is and how NATO works, which I haven't seen anybody in the mainstream media actually talk about the fact that Ukraine isn't actually ever going to become a NATO member state. It has to get the approval of every other country, and Germany and France aren't going to go for it. That's a major issue. The corruption in Ukraine is a major issue. The fact that it has, one separatist region and one region controlled by Russia are all issues that will prevent Ukraine from becoming a NATO member state. And nobody even discusses that. They're not like, so, where's Ukraine on working towards the path to becoming a state ready to be a NATO member? They're just all focused on, Russia said that they don't want Ukraine in NATO. And I guess, yeah, anyway, Joanne, did you have something though?
Yeah, in the Blinken presser today, in the Q&A period, it did come up about Biden's input to it. And he said, well, yeah, he did have input. We reviewed it with him multiple times. And then they said something about how he did an edit. So it kind of fell apart a little bit, the fact that Biden was in it. But whether or not Biden, his judgment and analysis are all there, I don't know. But he did. There is a little clip of him saying that if this war happens, it would change the world. Mm-hmm. So he does understand the seriousness of it, at least for that.
Yeah,
for what it's worth.
Did he say that really recently? I hadn't seen that.
I saw the clip just in the last couple of days, so yeah. I think it was very recent. Yeah.
I think it might have been at the presser where he also said the thing about if it's a minor incursion. And, these are the parts where you see Joe Biden, you're like, oh, this guy actually understands the reality of the situation on the ground in Ukraine, which no other American officials are acting like they do. Not the press secretary, of course, you just expect them to do spin, but still, Antony Blinken, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, all these people have a completely unrealistic view of what's going to happen in Ukraine and what's happening there. And, that's really concerning. But I actually think that Biden understands what's happening. And again, how much he pays attention to this part of his administration's profile. Like, obviously right now it's a big deal, but at the same time, so is COVID and a lot of other issues. One thing I was going to note today, the announcement of Stephen Breyer, that's right, the Supreme Court justice is retiring. This is really going to captivate America for whatever reason. Well, I understand kind of why it's very important, but these are the kind of things that really gets everybody ramped up and involved in paying attention to that issue. So maybe that'll take some of the attention and focus off of the Russia issue, I was actually thinking. But, a lot of people are paying attention to this right now.
Lincoln also mentioned that, that there were more shipments of weapons to Ukraine, that he was going to Congress this week or next week for, I don't know, to notify that, something about some more weapons. So I don't have the detail on that. But he said there also is economic aid coming too. So they're going to throw some money at Ukraine as well, some additional money.
With these dual bills in the House and Senate, Ukraine is on track to become the third highest recipient of U.S. military aid at this point. And I thought it was interesting too how they keep saying 500 million, because they authorized 300 for this year under the NDAA, and then right in December, Biden approved an additional 200. And now they're voting on it next week on the House bill. And now you have a House delegation headed to Kiev. And they're going to say the same things that Klobuchar and Wicker and Blumenthal were saying the other week. So it's just awful. And to that point about Biden being more aware of what's going on, like I like that moment when that Fox News reporter said to him, "Mr. President, why are you waiting for Putin to make his first move?" This whole rhetoric about you should just drop sanctions now. Why wait? And he goes, what a stupid question. And it's like, it is a stupid question. So, you know, I mean, he could provide a more substantive answer, obviously. But yeah.
I thought he asked about inflation. I thought that
that was Steve Doocy. This was like the week before. Or
okay. Another hot mic.
Yeah. It's two Fox News reporters he's called or said we're stupid here in like the last 2 weeks.
So a couple other points I have that I think generally make me more optimistic, and that is, while the Biden administration is talking about doing things, nothing they're talking about doing is actually going to prevent a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, maybe the people who work for Joe Biden really don't understand this, and they really think that they're going to prevent a Russian invasion of Ukraine with Javelin and Stinger missiles, but I really don't think that's the case. And I don't think that they think 8,500 troops being on heightened preparedness is actually going to do anything to prevent a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so, you know, maybe these are things that they're doing just for like PR and not necessarily to stoke American fears of Russia, but maybe to appease the American hawks and the war state and everything like that. I don't know. I mean, like, that's kind of a generous interpretation, but it's a way to look at this a little bit more optimistically, because again, they are kind of irrelevant, the amount of weapons we're talking about sending right now. You know, as somebody told me today, a good example would be like, you know, if somebody wanted to prevent the U.S., if the U.S. was going to invade Mexico, there's nothing you could do to prevent the U.S. from taking Mexico City. China could send the Mexicans all the weapons that China could manage to send the Mexicans, and the U.S. will find ways to destroy the shipments, to and just it's just proximity, geography wise, too close. It's not going to work, and that's the situation that you face in Ukraine. That no matter how many weapons the U.S. pours in, Russia will be able to overwhelm it just by proximity and geography and who's the military power here and who could do what. And so, all of that is a very important in reality that, should prevent any kind of conflict from happening. But I think there are some other really important things happening that do start to change the balance. And maybe the first and most important one is, I think Russia really, really doesn't care about U.S. sanctions. I think we've finally reached the point where the Russians have faced so many U.S. sanctions for so long, but not only that, the U.S. has sanctioned so many countries around the world: Syria, Iran, North Korea, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Zimbabwe, Mali is now facing massive sanctions. All of these countries have essentially, trade with each other. And so, them and the countries that are willing to abstain and the countries that can't help but do business with Russia, like, Europeans importing the gas, and Turkey and the Caucasus, and India and things like this, means that Russia is able to absorb the blow of U.S. sanctions, even if that includes being withdrawn from the SWIFT. I saw this week that Russia and China announced they were carrying out joint naval drills after they had the week before carried out drills with Iran, Russia, and China, but then they were doing just Iran, China naval drills in the, I think, Arabian Sea. But they also, this was from the Russians, said that Russia and China had talked about bilateral trade in national currencies. And so, they're talking about being ready to move on from the SWIFT. And, of course, for people who don't know, that's like international, the way business is done. If you're changing through current countries and currencies, a lot of times you got to go through the SWIFT. And so that being sanctioned by the U.S. or, Russia being sanctioned by and prevent from using SWIFT would be prevent them largely, I guess, from operating in the U.S. operated global economy. But it seems like now there's enough of the global economy that's been cut off that they could operate on their own. And I think that's really, really important. It really changes the balance of power and that the leverage that the U.S. has over Russia. Joanne, I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, they've been working on an alternative to the SWIFT system for, I don't know, I think a couple of years at least. I don't think it would be a smooth transition necessarily, but they wouldn't be just like completely out in the cold with nothing left to do. And there have been a lot more bilateral trades where countries decide to just pay in their own currencies. That's been happening more and more. I don't know. They could be bluffing, but I think they probably are. They probably are ready to handle it. And with the condition that is a whole nother subject, but the condition that the financial system globally is in, the economies and things like that. And I personally think that there's a deliberate breaking down of the economy going on that's tied into all this, but it's just a whole segue. I don't want to get into it. So I don't know. I think that might have something to do with it. I think that it is, I can say confidently, it's not half the threat that it used to be. They've been planning for this. They've also been stockpiling gold. Somebody, I don't know what happened with the ruble, but that was fluctuating yesterday. But that wasn't a great catastrophe either. I just think, like you basically said, we've sort of worn out. What else can we sanction? Who else can we sanction in Russia? I mean, let's be real.
Right. And are we willing to sanction the Germans for continuing to use the Nord Stream 2 pipeline after they invade Ukraine? I mean, right, that's just, the U.S. isn't going to sanction Germany. And my guess is that Russia has made that calculation as well. And that Germany needs the energy. I think another issue that's really important and really doesn't get talked about in the U.S. enough is that the 2014 regime change in Ukraine was a major cultural shift, or at least the U.S. tried to pull off one, and has really radicalized some elements. But also, I've seen a couple reports, and Joanne, you've helped to confirm this for me, that the black and red, like right sector flag that was from the UPA, which is Ukrainian militias and like kind of far right ethno-nationalist type militias from back like at post World War II and in World War II and everything like that, involved in various atrocities and things like that, is flying at government buildings and in places of official capacity. And I think this represents a real effort from the U.S. to, I don't know, like maybe not intentionally. So I don't think, the U.S. set out to say like we want to, purge Ukraine of the ethnic Russians, but essentially the U.S. has backed the side in Ukraine that is interested in really doing their best to purge, the ethnic Russian cultural part of the country. And this is going to come to a breaking point. And I think Putin, if you listen to his speeches, this has been more so recently, is absolutely concerned about the plight of ethnic Russians in the former USSR states in particular, and sees the situation in Ukraine as, that being something that he maybe has to do. I mean, maybe, that's looking at generously from Putin's perspective, and it's just like a propaganda point that he's going to capitalize on in Russia, that, I did this in part to protect the ethnic Russians who are living in Ukraine. But at the same time, this is a very historical and part of Russia, really, that we're talking about in eastern Ukraine. And so, that the right sector flags being raised there are probably somewhat intolerable culturally in Russia. And so I think that's a really important note. And I was just wondering if I know Mark Sloboda has talked about that in the past on your show. I don't know if he mentioned that in your interview today, Joanne.
Yeah, I specifically asked him about that. He said, yeah, those and the Wolf's Angle. I think it's the OAN is what the original organization was. The I don't know. So the supremacists, the ones who want purity of Ukrainian ethnicity and things like this, and just absolutely hate the Russians. and are a real danger to the people in eastern Ukraine. That's not an exaggeration.
Mm-hmm. And on this point, it's just
you know what? One more thing.
Yeah.
They're only a small percent of the population. Like they really don't have any kind of a plurality, but they're so well connected. They're so, embedded into the government, the security structures, their National Guard, and that kind of thing. So that sort of, they're better armed and they're more dangerous and they're embedded into the system, which is what makes them so dangerous.
I would imagine it's a little bit like Ukraine, where if you're a fanatic who's willing to use violence, that kind of makes you an effective fighter. Not to necessarily praise these people or anything like that, but if you're the type of person who's willing to commit like ethnic violence or something like that, you probably don't spend your weekends hanging out with friends, like chilling. You spend your time like drilling in various militia things and diehard dedicated fighters, and then it probably has like a somewhat magnetic effect, right? Where if you're the most effective fighters, you're going to get the most advanced weapons, and that makes you more powerful. Also, if you're the most effective fighting force, then other people who, maybe aren't necessarily like Azov battalion level neo-Nazis, but don't really have like the biggest objection to like that's not their top primary concern, then they're willing to join those same forces and fight along with them because they're just the most effective fighters, and it swells the ranks of those kind of forces. So like you said, small percentage but big influence. Now on that, one point that nobody is making, I think it's just so important here, is if we're talking about people killing Americans in America, who's a bigger risk? The Ukrainian ethno-nationalists, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, or Vladimir Putin and the Russians? I mean, right? Like, even if you look recent history, find somebody a Russian has killed, like officially in a state capacity in the United States, versus there's been a couple violent crimes committed by ethno-nationalists who traveled to Ukraine and trained up with various militias there, and including the Azov battalion. So, this kind of this is a real threat and a real problem to the United States. Not that I think the neo-Nazis are going to take over the country or hold any particular power, but if you're just talking about, somebody who's going to go to Ukraine and be, learning like battlefield drills and stuff like that, this seems really concerning to me. So,
Kyle, it's also used to, I don't know if you say control, but to definitely influence and keep in line the Ukrainian leadership, particularly Zelensky, right? That's one of the reasons why the Minsk agreements were never able to. They include some agreed autonomy, ability to hold elections for, the Donbass area. But if Zelensky tries, or any Ukrainian leader tries to actually implement that, then these extremist groups threaten, and they basically act as a control mechanism too.
Mm-hmm. And I heard Aaron Mate make this point on the Monday morning show that he does with Katie Halper. And he said that the way Minsk 2 would be set up and the kind of autonomy and, the power structure that would exist in Ukraine post Minsk 2, that would essentially prevent Ukraine from joining NATO because the Donetsk, the Donbass region would have a veto in the Ukrainian government over them joining NATO. And so assuming that, the heavily ethnic Russian part of Ukraine ever decides to join NATO, then that the Minsk 2 would essentially prevent Ukraine from ever joining NATO, which I thought was an interesting point that I hadn't heard very much.
Right, which is a big incentive for Putin not to, what they're saying, invade and either take the Donbass or certainly go into Kiev. But I will say this: if they, they keep warning about the false flag coming and this and that, Natasha Bertrand in the White House and the Pentagon. But a spokesman for the Donetsk People's Republic recently came out and said that the Kiev's forces are preparing an offensive, and that they're preparing military vehicles and self-propelling minesweepers, and that he said that they're making preparations for to resolve the crisis militarily. And if that happens, the way the narrative is set up, they're just going to blame the Russians. And I just saw a report on TASS, or a report from a Russian official that said that because of the passport situation in the Donbass, where they have Russian passports, there's I've heard different estimates, but this Russian official said that there's at least 500,000 Russian citizens in the Donbass. So if that happens, that's such a talk about a tripwire for war. If Russian citizens start getting murdered in mass like that, it forces Putin's hand immediately. And like you said, these Nazi and Nazi adjacent forces, that's their main. That's what gets them off, is killing ethnic Russians. And so it's just a recipe for disaster right now. So the main thing, and so that's why I'm obviously most hopeful for the Normandy Format stuff and ensuring some autonomy. But like you said, you have brown shirts out there ensuring that that's going to be thwarted.
And that's the thing, not enough people are talking about what's actually happening on the contact line there,
Yeah. Well, particularly with the fact in that Yahoo article, and I know it was an official statement and all that, but they talk about that the CIA paid paramilitaries are over there fighting and making real battlefield gains on behalf of the Ukrainians. And so it's, only a matter of time before one of those conflicts, Connor says, involve the death of somebody that at least holds a Russian passport. And this was a big issue, 4 maybe years ago or so, where the Donbass region was in exile for several years and people couldn't get passports because there were no official Ukrainian government buildings, and so you couldn't travel outside the region, which not that I'm sure that it's fine living in the Donbass and everything, but you might want to leave it every once in a while. And so if you can't get a passport, you can't do that. Now maybe Putin could have allowed some travel to Russia, but you couldn't go to another country. And so I think Putin's hand was kind of forced there, but we now have a very problematic consequence from that. I think that was most of the major points that I had wanted to hit on. So maybe we'll do our little wrap it up thing here and start with Connor. And I guess I'm not asking you maybe to make predictions, because that's, kind of impossible and everything like that. But what are your thoughts on going forward? What are you particularly paying attention to, and anything along those lines?
Well, certainly, you can't rule out the possibility of covert operators, either backed by the U.S. or not, or some elements in the CIA doing something that starts off a chain reaction where there is conflict and the idea that they do a lot of projecting right now, this stuff about, the Russians are going to do a coup and put some puppet regime in power in Kiev. And turns out, I'm blanking on that guy's name, but he's been banned from the country now, I think, for years and under sanctions since 2018. But they also, they say the things about the false flags. And I think that that's, again, probably more projection. I'm sure there's plans in place, somewhere anyway, for that sort of an operation. But so mainly, I'm hoping for the best, obviously, and that Biden and Blinken are kind of putting on a show for domestic consumption and to get the Congress and the media off their backs, which was indicated in those reports that said that they weren't going to make the letter, public right away. But Lavrov's responses are not encouraging. It doesn't sound like, but maybe maybe they know that, maybe it's an understanding. I forget who I was reading. I was talking to Kyle about this the other day after the show. I forget what column I was reading. Somebody made the point that it's, if they are sort of hyping up tension so that if they do reach an agreement, there could be some sort of a political win for Biden. And if I was Putin and I was trying to actually get concessions, you would probably want to incentivize that on some level with the guy you're talking to one-on-one, the other head of state, to see because I'm sure the Russians are, and we know they're very aware of how hawkish the American political system is and how he's really, trying to cover his right flank at all times. And it's one of the main problems with Trump. The Helsinki summit, and it's a perfect example of that. But right now, mainly the weapons sales and these bills in the Congress just seem to be kind of more of the same, but they still, obviously ramp up tensions. But I mainly, I guess I'm going to see what happens with the Belarus drills. I was just reading, Kyle, you sent me an article from Anti-Empire, and they're saying mainly the thing you want to see is like what the movements of the Russian forces are after the Belarus drills. If they head back to Russia or if they kind of stay in the area, like, what the movements are at that point. Also, and mainly just I'm going to be keeping an eye on the Normandy Format talks and seeing where they go. And they're meeting in, like I said, in Berlin in 2 weeks. So at this point, I just think we have kind of a muddy vision of where things are going right now. But it does seem to me that with the Ukrainians throwing cold water on things the way they are, I think that I don't know. I have a bad feeling about where things are going, but I tend to want to be more optimistic, obviously, with the consequences here. So I'm hoping that the real wild card, of course, is like you just said, the brown shirts and the issue of them basically boxing in Kiev and any kind of more moderate elements in the regime from giving the Donbass autonomy, and if a war starts, it's just going to spiral out of control very rapidly. That's essentially where I'm at right now, is just kind of looking at the different moving parts. But particularly, I'm hoping for the main thing I'm hoping for is that the French and the Germans can put a stop to this and give some solid assurances to the Russians that maybe the Americans just can't.
Yeah, and Joanne briefly mentioned this earlier, but it's worth noting that the Russian attitude and rhetoric seems significantly more, at best, blunt, maybe aggressive even, that they very firm about, what, they're looking for and to get out of all of this. And so, that I don't know, I feel like in the past, Putin, Lavrov, and essentially the entire Russian State Department was always very polite, business-like, and some of the official statements are still like that, but there's also a lot of, and not just the calling Stoltenberg, saying doesn't exist in reality and things like that, but just very, very blunt. Now, we have seen what was it in 2007 where Putin lost it with the reporter saying what do I have to do to get through to you people? This is a real issue. We've seen some of this before, but not on this consistent and seemingly planned level, right? Where this is the Russian position, I think, is now to be more aggressive, right? Not to, playing to the Russian aggression narrative or anything like that, but building up troops on the border and, putting forward these security proposals the way the Russians did, very, I get, not that I think they're particularly impossible to meet demands, at least, some of them are maybe a little far-fetched to think the U.S. ever go for it. But, admitting Ukraine isn't going to be in NATO, that should be something that the U.S. agreed to. They probably won't, but it is something they should. But, the Russians laying all this out, it is, I think, a fairly different style than at least I've seen in the past. So, Joanne, anything on that, and then your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think the attitude is much different. What the difference I see is that they don't seem to care politically about their image, their in the world. They don't. They've been called the aggressor and demonized so much that, like other terms that are overused and unfairly used, I think a lot of people blow it off. I think a lot of Americans still believe the terrible Russian villain narrative, but the rest of the world, I'm not so convinced that they're buying that. And in the process, I think that we've become the villain. When you see polls about other countries and what they perceive as the biggest threat, we come up high on the list now, things have changed quite a lot. So they don't seem to care whether they are seen as the aggressor or not. The stuff going on in that contact line is very sketchy. There's something like 125,000 military there, and we don't know how many paramilitaries, how many shock troops or whatever. One of the things that goes again, that prevents Ukraine from being allowed into NATO, not that they wouldn't bend the rules, they probably would, but you're not allowed to have like a civil war or territorial dispute or things like that. And so if they could grab the Donbass and, put that to rest, that would check another thing off the NATO box. There are some other things, like there are resources in that area, although I don't know if those are enough of an incentive. And we just have some absolutely crazy people. How else can you describe the neocons at this point? And not just the neocons, just, our State Department, the Nuland, what do you want to call them? The Nuland gang. There's no, party involved anymore. It's across the political spectrum. So I don't know. I'm really concerned about that, about even like a rogue element tripping something off, kicking something off and turning it into, I don't know whether it'll go to a full-scale war. I'm not optimistic. I think there's at least a 50-50 chance. I think that the Minsk agreements have been tried, and I think there's a lot of sincerity in there. But the Ukrainian government, even if they wanted to agree to the Minsk various different things that they still are under dispute, they've got this policing force that if they did agree to that, then, they get attacked. They show up, they create another Maidan kind of situation. And that's why the regime change operation by the Russians seems like they might actually do something like that, because they know that you can't get any further right now with the people who are in political power right now in Ukraine. The way things have been arranged, no progress can be made on those Minsk agreements or much of anything. So, there are people who think that in the original Maidan that Russia should have moved faster, that Putin should have prevented that new government from coming in, or should have reversed it. And I don't know, you wonder whether some people are looking for a do-over. The Russians on, the 2014 Maidan, the Ukrainians on the embarrassment of they called it an ATO, anti-terrorist operation, when they went into eastern Ukraine and they expected to just, overrun the two separatist regions, and they're still smarting from the whole issue with Crimea. You just wonder whether zealots are looking for a do-over there. I just think there's just too many factors that point in a negative direction. And so I think it's at least a half and half that it happens.
Yeah. A great point. Like, we didn't even talk about the fact that former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko is facing treason charges in Ukraine right now. So, there's so many levels that, as Joanne's saying, that this could go wrong, right? Where it could even be like more of an internal conflict in Ukraine that pushes the government to take a more aggressive stance or to empower more radical elements or in things like this. Maybe Zelensky sees the Donbass as a solution to the neo-Nazi problems, and that they could all go die over there, right? Like, these are the kinds of things and calculations that governments certainly have made in the past and could make in the future here. So, and I don't think Zelensky is any kind of political genius or anything like that. I think he's relatively a novice. And, so anyways, I guess my reason for optimism is that in the short run, any kind of conflict between the U.S. and Russia is always obviously the wrong move. And so I guess I'm somewhat optimistic that everybody will always continue to divert war because war would be so catastrophic. And so that's my little bit of why I'm holding on to as good news. Also, as like some of the arguments that Ray McGovern has made and some of the points that Gilbert Doctorow have made that I think have been absolutely excellent on, it does seem like there's like some negotiations going on here and something can come from it. I guess the problem that I have is in the long run, it seems like at best we're going to ratchet it up 3 notches here and bring it down 1 or 2, and we're not even going to go back to where we were before. I don't think the United States is anywhere near willing to make an agreement with Russia on Ukraine that is long-term sustainable resolution and not simply a 1 to 2 year band-aid where the U.S. I think that the U.S. would make that kind of deal, and with the people that you have in like the State Department right now, they would make that deal, but they would continue to build up Ukraine and really push to make Ukraine a de facto NATO member, a state that the U.S. would defend. Now, I don't think it will actually happen that the U.S. would go to war for Ukraine, but them thinking it might happen could really start a war. And so, I guess my biggest fear in all this is the potential political miscalculations, not only from the idiots in the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government in general, the hawks in Congress, and, the general foreign policy blob that's all on board with Joe Biden isn't doing enough, but also, potentially from a mistake made by Zelensky or other parties in Ukraine. And that, it's possible even that maybe this is a mistake on Putin's part, maybe it's not, that he miscalculates and thinks that this is his best opportunity to take the shot now because he understands that the U.S. and the West are just going to continue to pour weapons into Ukraine. And even if it won't actually change the balance and prevent a Russia from being able to take over Ukraine or anything like that, they could certainly increase the price that Putin will have to pay to take Ukraine back. If you give tons and tons of Stingers and Javelin missiles like that is going to make some kind of difference. And so, a lot of my concerns are right there that there's going to be no resolution to this. The Americans are going to continue to double and triple down on what they've already been doing in Ukraine. And that's put us on the path to conflict that, we've led to today, where it seems like we're very close to confrontation right now. And we're not going to take ourselves off that path. So even if we divert from it a little bit right now, long term, I don't see how we ultimately maneuver away from it. I guess the only good news I have in all of it is that the Americans don't have any appetite for war, and it is awful as this sounds, the Americans are willing to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian, and it's going to be a bloody, terrible mess for the people of Ukraine, but I think the U.S. stays out of it, and if that happens, I think Putin makes the calculation not to expand the war any further to any NATO states, and this again is terrible for the people, probably particularly of Western Ukraine, and who have supported the U.S.-backed government there, but at the same time, it does stay limited to that, and once again, it's the people that are closest in bed with the Americans that will likely suffer the most, I think, ultimately from this policy. So I don't know. Anything else we should mention before we sign off here? Joanne, you look like you might have one more thing.
No, I'm good. I'm good, Kyle.
Connor?
I was just going to say, I was listening. I think you're right that they're going to be closing it in. And Joanne, the more I think about it, I think you might be right about their attempt to do a regime change. That if that could potentially lead to, if that could be less costly than an actual conflict where they have to deal with it in like a prolonged or protracted war, that would probably, that would make sense if you were going to try and do it that way. Since it's such an unstable situation, they can't rely on.
The only way to progress, right, for them.
Right, if diplomacy is literally impossible.
Yeah. Well,
and so, but I know that they were just Scott was just interviewing Clint Ehrlich, and he was talking about how Ukraine is modernizing their medium range missiles, and it's going to over time here, and I'm not sure what the time frame is, but to give them quite a bit more ability to hit Russian cities, which would make it would raise the costs of a war with Ukraine. So as that gap gets narrower, the Russians may feel like they have to go ahead and do it. And like you said, that New York Times article that we talked about yesterday, they said that Milley and Austin had told Western allies that if this happens, the CIA is going to covertly back an insurgency, and the Pentagon's going to do it overtly. And they apparently, who is it? They said it might have been Austin and Milley saying, to their Russian counterparts that it'll be long and bloody, like an insurgency. So like that's all already on the table. And if that is the case, I definitely could see DC being willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. But if that is the case, I mean, if they can keep it if that's in the worst case scenario, if they can keep it just like where they're not expanding it into these other NATO states, that would be obviously preferable to the situation that, where it could be like NATO versus Russia. And the obviously Biden and I believe Kirby now have said multiple times, even in the last couple of weeks, that there's no way they're sending U.S. troops to Ukraine. But the problem is you already have 100 Florida National Guard troops right in Ukraine right now, special forces, and of course the CIA paramilitaries. So in the event of any of this, you're probably looking at Americans getting killed at some point.
British
trainers and Canadian trainers and things like that.
And they could be in other Eastern European countries that are, very close by. So.
And so anyways, and I guess the Olympics are coming up, and I can't help but think that Putin would probably really savor the irony of something happening in Ukraine, involving a major shift towards the Russian side during an Olympic Games going on. But anyways, everybody, besides from listening to conflicts of interest and around the empire, the one kind of good thing about what's happening right now is there's so much good analysis being written by people. Ray McGovern, Doug Bondow, Connor Freeman had a great article this week. Anatole Levine, usually at the Quincy Institute, Douglas McGregor, I could sit here all, Ted Galen Carpenter, Dan Larison, have all put out great articles recently. And so it's been really interesting to read it all. And I hope that we've diluted some of the best points of, who we've been reading and studying and brought them to you here. So Joanne, Connor, thank you guys so much for doing this. And I don't know, my guess is we'll be doing another one of these sometime in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think you're right.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
You.
Good night. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Kyle Anzalone and Connor Freeman. Follow Kyle on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. Follow Connor at Freeman'sMind96. And follow the podcast at @con_interest. Also, find their writing at the Libertarian Institute. This is a fully independent podcast. In this age of censorship, your support's more important than ever. Go to the website aroundtheempire.com to find the various ways that you can get access to bonus content and support the show. Also, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave reviews. That helps us. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. Join us on Telegram, t.me/aroundtheempire. And we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody. Stay strong.